More on fiscal policy. We always got to be careful distinguishing between deficits and debt. Now, this can be highly adversarial since so much of the media we consume is trying to confuse us. You got to be careful. In the news, you often hear government spending is greater than taxes, which means the government is running a deficit. A deficit will increase the debt. In economics, we distinguish between the stock and the flow of lots of measures. The flow in this case is the deficit. The stock is the debt. The deficit is the amount that spending exceeds revenue in a particular year. That's financed by borrowing. The debt is the amount that was borrowed in all those past years. That's the stock. Governments choose deficits for all sorts of reasons, often wars, bad economic times, sometimes choices by politicians. In the US, we have the issue that Social Security is going to get more expensive in future decades as total payments to senior are going to rise to become larger than the payroll taxes funding it. Healthcare funding is also rising. Now, one question that confuses people, can the government run a deficit forever? The answer is, yeah, sure, easy. Trivial. Governments never die, at least not from old age, so it can run a deficit forever. Certainly in the case if the deficit is smaller than the growth rate of the economy, then the debt is going to be a stable or falling fraction of GDP. We see lots of governments around the world that are basically planning to run a deficit forever. Now I can ask, does that cause problems? And the answer is maybe, definitely maybe, sometimes. Economists have looked. Is there some level of debt that's too high? And the answer is there's not really any good evidence for exactly a threshold, particularly for developed countries like the US. There's not an immediate problem created by the deficit. As the debt gets larger, then interest rates might rise if the government has trouble selling bonds. Recall where this fits with all our equations. We talked a few chapters back, equations where investment, which is the new increment to the capital stock, is funded by private savings plus public savings plus foreign savings, where foreign savings is the trade deficit. That's because foreigners are sending us stuff, actual physical goods. In return, they're getting pieces of paper like bonds or stocks. We write that as investment. I equals S, savings, plus T minus G, which is the opposite of the federal government deficit, plus M minus X, which is the trade deficit. Shuffle terms around to see that private domestic savings must satisfy that equation there. The bottom line is a bigger government deficit means either there's going to be less investment, more savings, or a worse trade deficit. Any or sometimes all of the above. The US often has what's called twin deficits, both the federal government deficit and the trade deficit. It's often going to be ameliorated by changes in exchange rates. Politicians often claim they want to lower the trade deficit and also end up increasing the budget deficit. They claim they want certain things, but it's a basic truism, you cannot have all the good things. I mean, I'd like to be able to drink all the beer that I want and never get fat, but that ain't going to happen. Politicians, too, they say they want certain things, but then they don't want to make the hard choices to get those things. I mentioned there could be some level of government debt or deficit that's too high, and that would cause crowding out. As budget deficits rise, governments have to sell more bonds in order to finance these deficits. Basic supply and demand tells us that if the supply shifts outward to the right, demand doesn't change, then the price is going to go down. For bonds, price going down means interest rate rises. Long ago, back at the beginning of class, we described the math about why there's an inverse relationship between bond prices and interest rate. Interest rates on government bonds rise. That raises the opportunity cost for firms. They have to compete with the government to get loans. Many corporations also sell bonds. Businesses have to finance projects at higher interest rates. they will decrease the amount of investment that they make. That's crowding out. Higher interest rates on government bonds are going to mean fewer private investment projects. Now, that can be moderated by monetary policy. The Fed, central bank, can keep interest rates lower, print more money. That might cause other problems like inflation. But we should be clear, it's not necessarily wrong for the government to be spending more money on various projects. Governments make investments in things like physical capital, roads, bridges, ports, human capital, education, what we're doing here, knowledge capital if they're investing in technology, research and development. There could be synergies, business investment, and government spending more money on something like education could raise the amount of investment that private businesses make. Finally, some part of economics education is pulling weeds. We hear people saying things that they think are true, but I want to make you understand there's nothing there really. We hear about supply side, quote, economics, unquote. It's not economics, it's just politics. There's this thing called the Laffer curve, which it's not supposed to be laughed at. It's the guy's name. It's not meant to be laughable. But the idea is the tax rate is zero, then the government will collect zero taxes. Yeah. And then if the tax rate goes all the way 100%, then tax revenue would again be zero because nobody'd ever pay it. So if we plot the tax rate against tax revenue, there must be a hump somewhere. Which, I mean, maybe okay, true enough, but the trick is then saying that, well, we believe without any evidence that we're on the far side of that hump, and thus if we decrease tax rates, we might increase tax revenue. Governments have tried that experiment at various times, and they've been wrong each and every time. It's taking a basic statement that's true in limited cases and then overgeneralizing. It's kind of wish fulfillment. Similarly, modern monetary theory, again, not economics, just politics. The basic idea is government deficits don't matter. Central bank can print money to cover deficits. Money printer go brr. Sometimes MMT will add the stipulation that if inflation were to become a problem, the government can reduce spending or raise taxes. Again, there's a grain of truth here. Standard economic theory agrees. When the economy is at zero interest rate, then deficits don't matter. It's certainly true for that case. But when interest rates are above zero, there's no evidence for MMT. It'd be nice if the fairy tale had held true, but it doesn't.